Welcome, everybody, to the first expert conversation in this summer's film series, which is doing a deep dive into pre-revolution films in China. I think that film is one of the best ways to understand China, and this summer is going to take us on a fascinating journey through history. I hope you've all had a chance to see the films we're discussing tonight: Labor's Love from 1922 and Big Road, made in 1935. I will say that as I watched these movies, I kept wondering what audiences would have thought about these films back then. And we're going to learn a lot about that and lots more tonight from our incredible lineup of experts. I'm Dinda Elliott, Director of Programs at China Institute, and we are thrilled tonight to have some of the really the top Chinese film experts in the Western world, I guess. So let me introduce them. Weihong Bao is an associate professor of Chinese and film studies at UC Berkeley and the author of Fiery Cinema, The Emergence of an Effective Medium in China, 1915 to 1945. Weihong focuses on late 19th century visual and performance culture, Chinese language cinema, comparative media history and theory, and the intersection between film and media. Richard Peña is a professor of film studies at Columbia University. And from 1988 to 2012, he was the program director of the Film Society of Lincoln Center and the director of the New York Film Festival. Richard, who is an avid watcher of Chinese film and a real expert on that subject, is going to guide our conversation tonight. And in the fall, he's going to help us present a series of films that are on his list of the greatest Chinese films since the 1980s. So I hope you will all tune into that. Finally, we've got Christopher Wray, who is a professor of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. Christopher's new book, Chinese Film Classics, 1922 to 1949, was published last month. So he really knows a lot about what we're talking about tonight. Christopher also created a series of incredible online film resources, including ChineseFilmClassics.org, which we will put into the, we'll upload it somehow so you can find it, ChineseFilmClassics.org, and a YouTube playlist of more than 20 subtitled films and 22 video lectures. I will add that the films we've watched this week are courtesy of Christopher Wray, who has also himself added his own, done new subtitles for Labor's Love, which you will have seen when you watch the film. So Christopher is also the author of A History of Laughter in China, and he translated a Ming Dynasty collection called The Book of Swindles. So he knows a lot about comedy and mischief in the history of China. So with no further ado, I want to hand it over to Richard. Why don't you all turn on your cameras and unmute yourself and come onto the screen, and I'll hand it over to Richard. We're so delighted to have all of you. Thank you so much for being with us. Oh, one final thing is we will, at around 15 minutes before the hour, so at what is that, 8:15, I guess, take some questions from the audience. So if you'll please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A section, and Richard will try to get to them at the end. But welcome, everybody. Over to you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Dinda, and great to see you again, both Weihong and Christopher. Thanks for doing this. Really looking forward to having this conversation. Sometimes when I teach Chinese cinema, I begin the class, actually, the first day by saying, if one were to say, what's the biggest story of the last 50 years? You could just say in one word, China, because in many ways, China has transformed just about every aspect of human endeavor, whether it's business or science or various arts or many things like that. And I think that applies somewhat also to film studies, in that for me, just when I was beginning my career as a programmer, I was already teaching somewhat. The discovery of Chinese cinema, which for me was in the 1980s, in a way kind of changed so much of the kind of received wisdom that we had that had been based on really pretty much European or American models, that suddenly we began to look at film somewhat differently or ask questions in a different way, because the more we learned about Chinese film, both older and recent Chinese film at that time, the more it challenged a lot of our assumptions about film history and theory and things like that. So I'm delighted that now with the new refurbished China Institute, which have a very active film program, that we're starting at the beginning and going back to the early days to maybe once again ask some of those questions. So let me begin asking the first question to Christopher. This period, 1922 for Laborer's Love up to 34, 35 for The Great Road or The Big Highway or whatever we call the film, Dalu, is really an extraordinary period in terms of just turbulence, the number of things that were going on. Can you give us a kind of overall panorama for our audience of what was China like in this 12, 13-year period?
It was pretty chaotic. So the Qing dynasty fell 1911. You had a Republic of China starting January 1st, 1912. And by the time you get to, you have a president who becomes something of a dictator. He dies in 1916. There's this period of internecine fighting between warlords or militarists all across China. So things are extremely unstable. And by the time you get to 1922, when Laborer's Love was made, China is still in the throes of major internal problems. And it was, and partly because of the stability, there was a lot of possibility. There was a lot of experimentation, including in cinema. So this was kind of the 1920s was kind of the era of the small entrepreneurs in the film industry. By the 1930s, and you have a major expedition by the Nationalist Party and their army to displace these warlords. And so 1926 to 1928, you do have this successful military expedition that resulted in the founding of a new government, 1928 in Nanking. And so after that, you have a little bit more stability, but it's only relative to what was going on in China, because Japan had been making incursions, right? They had gotten a big part of Shandong after World War I. And, to make a long story short, bombings and attacks in 1931, 1932. So in films of the 1930s, there's a lot of references to war and an invading enemy. And part of that, including in The Great Road, and part of that is because, indeed, China had been under invasion for years. And so this was not history, this was current events.
Thank you, Christopher. That's really a terrific summation of all the many things that were going on at that time. Weihong, if I can ask you, if you could put it more, perhaps in a more specifically cultural context, I would guess that we could maybe start with thinking about cinema with regards to May 4th and the way in which perhaps we can see all of Chinese cinema growing out of the very influential cultural movement that began in that year and that date.
Oh, that's a great comment and great question. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, it's May 4th, of course, is very important. It started in 1919, and actually the big political events happened on May the 4th, and that's why that's the name, where the name comes from, and really becomes the marker of the modern China, which has to do with the notion of democracy and science. So this dual interest in moving China forward to embrace basically Western notions of science and democracy was very much imbricated in the cultural scene. And cinema was a big part of that story, although historically for a long time, cinema was considered outside the May 4th political kind of movement because it was very commercial enterprise. So it's very interesting to think about cinema as something that intersected historically with this new Enlightenment movement, but at the same time had some tension with it. And so I think the film world is more ambivalent, I think, because of its various political ties and the connection with the so-called conservative and the so-called progressive. And also at the same time, different kind of people who are part of that scenario. So basically, just to make the long story short, I think to parallel the time span that Chris just laid out in the 1920s, which is really the beginning of where the films that we are seeing, it's more kind of a commercial enterprise. in a kind of diverse scene. And so when we think about the May 4th, one important marker is what we call as vernacular language movement. It's a language movement to make Chinese language more modern. And at the same time, we do have this kind of a popular literary movement, which is usually called the Mandarin and butterfly literary movement, right? So this is all popular literature. And so 1920s cinema, which was much closer to the Mandarin and butterfly kind of popular literary movement than the orthodox May 4th kind of vernacular language movement. So I think that already complicates this thing. And when we move to the 1930s, especially after the Japanese bombing in 1931, and so in the taking over of Manchuria, there's a very strong left turning of the whole cultural scene, and film also participated in that. So 1930s cultural horizon is quite different. But I think, Richard, you really put your finger on something very important to think about: cinema's broad relationship with the May 4th tradition.
Something you mentioned, Weihong, which is something that interests me very much, is when we think of the beginning of sound cinema at the late 1920s, one of the effects was to really, in many ways, jumpstart many cinemas around the world. I mean, the Mexican cinema, the Argentine cinema, the Egyptian cinema, the Turkish cinema, they all had silent films, but they really began as an industry and arguably as an art form, really with the coming of sound. Do you think it was that addition of the sound of Chinese, or as you just said, natural language, that really kind of gave a push for cinema to become really now a kind of more accepted art?
It's hard to, I think it's really hard to use sound as a kind of a marker of the level of artistic achievement, because many silent era filmmakers actually refused to step into sound era because they felt that silent cinema already achieved the epitome of film. And of course, sound is a very new dimension of cinema that poses so much challenge. But what's interesting, I think, about when we think about world cinema, the dimension of sound really brings into the question of national language. So sound cinema very much parallels the notion of national cinema, because in a way, in the case of Chinese cinema, sound cinema has a lot to do with the use of Mandarin as the national language, and sound cinema helped promoting that. At the same time, the question of sound cinema is also a very complex one in the case of China, just as in Japan and Russia and many other countries. I think in the US, we can say around 1927, right? The jazz singer is the marker. There's a kind of conversion to total sound cinema. Whereas in many other international contexts, because of, I think, economic conditions, that hurdle was actually very difficult to cross. So the films that you saw for today, for example, The Big Road, was a partial sound film, right? So there are a lot of kind of a hybrid products. That's also very interesting to consider. Another dimension to consider is to think about, in the silent era, there's a very strong interest to think about cinema itself that can transcend language, right? So there's a notion of cinema itself as a kind of international language, as a hieroglyph or as Esperanto. But when we come to sound cinema, we really have to address the question of national language. So that does make it very interesting. And aesthetically, I do think having that dimension of sound really enriches cinema and enriches so many experimental possibilities.
No, that's true. You make a great point, of course, about the Great Road being really a kind of hybrid. And it's interesting that that kind of hybridity existed both in Chinese and actually in Japanese cinema. It's interesting, if you see Japanese cinema, there are directors who make a sound film, then they go back to making a silent film, and then they make a sound film again. So there was a little more of a coexistence between those cinemas, whereas in the US and throughout the West, really, once you got to sound cinema, a curtain came down, there was no more silent cinema, and that was it. Speaking of language, though, I'm wondering if, since both of you are Chinese speakers, what about the language of a film like The Great Highway or the other films of the 30s? Was there debate about what kind of Chinese to use? And was that a problem if they wanted the films to be seen nationally?
And there was definitely an effort to promote Mandarin through cinema and through the gramophone industry. And I think The Great Road is an interesting case since, as you noted, it's a hybrid film, right? We have sound on disc, it's not live recorded sound, and it's really just songs, 4 songs, and a few sound effects, but not dialogue. In some later films, they'll show a title card and they'll also have dub sound over it. And the filmmaker Sun Yu said that they released an LP, they released a phonograph record at the same time that the film was released, and that the LP actually sold very well. It was quite profitable. So there was a commercial aspect to this, even though you look at this story, it's a bit of a mix, right? You have this patriotic, national construction narrative. We're building a great road to help the army defeat the enemy. You have all these genre elements like song and dance performances and like almost magic tricks and slapstick elements. You have some very pulpy stuff with like dungeon torture and escape and gimmick weapons. So it is quite a mix. And so I think that hybridity is really strong throughout the 1930s. But even in a film that's solidly of the silent age, like Labor is Love, that film is hybrid in some ways too. So like you mentioned the May 4 thing. Well, this is a film that actually has 2 titles. So one is 治国缘, like a marital destiny made by flinging fruit. And yuan, the notion of like fate or predestined romance, is very traditional in some ways. But like labor, 劳工之爱情, like both of those terms are kind of new neologisms or buzzwords. And you also have a story of someone who's really working for his love. Like he really earns it by with his carpentry skills. And so it's almost like the film is pulling in 2 directions just from its very title. So that's kind of a linguistic issue, even in this silent film. Not to mention that there's also that element of you have Chinese and English in the intertitles. So there's also this international market that the filmmakers were very aware of. And you see that actually in a lot of 1920s films too.
Yeah,
Weihong, do you want to add anything to that discussion?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think there's a lot of issue with the language. And so in the 30s, later in the 30s, the national government actually banned Cantonese language film. So there's quite a bit of tension. And also, I think it marks the fate of some of the actors and actresses, right? For example, Ran Yu, who was a big silent film star, but because she spoke Cantonese, she was not able to transition to sound cinema. And also she committed suicide later on. But in comparison, Hu Die, who was considered the queen of Chinese cinema, had a much longer career because she spoke perfect Mandarin. So I think one's linguistic ability also, I think, had to do with their stardom because of the national language policy.
Weihong, also, when we're speaking now of hybridity, is there a relationship? Christopher mentioned something I find fascinating, that they actually released a record of the Great Road that I guess one could listen to for the songs and whatever. Was there a lot of interplay between the Chinese recording industry, radio, or other arts at that time?
Oh yeah, definitely so. So for example, the woman who sings in The Big Road, Li Li, she was originally trained as a song and dance actress, right? And very famously, she was part of this group called the 明月歌舞团, the moon singing and dance troupe. And that troupe was founded by Li Jinghui, who was one of the most important modern composers. And that troupe traveled all across Southeast Asia, including Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, from the 1920s onwards. And Chen Yan also was trained in that school. So there's definitely a very strong connection between the recording industry. They definitely recorded their performance and their music were broadcasted over radio. So there's a much broader soundscape beyond cinema, which really enriches the reception of those songs. And that's why when you think about the early sound film, it's so important to think about theme songs, right? Because the theme songs are going to disseminate much broader than cinema itself. And people were consuming not only sound bites, but also just the printed songs, right? So that's a much broader industry in that sense.
Mhm. Let's go back to Laborer's Love. When you look at it, I mean, I guess for many of us, I'm sure many of the viewers who saw it too, you think of it as a kind of comic short. Did that kind of form exist in some way within Chinese culture at that time? Where, for example, I would think of that as almost like a short from a vaudeville show or something like that, that kind of comic. And of course, that passed directly to the cinema with people like Keaton and Chaplin and many others. Was there a kind of equivalent that you can think Laborer's Love might compare to?
And certainly in Chinese opera, you have a tradition. Yes, you can watch the whole 9-hour drama, or you can have the greatest hits.
Right. Which is how it's normally presented, I think, at least nowadays.
Yeah. And so that was not just for export. Sometimes people think, they're just sending like the best of the best abroad, for the watered down version or the selection. But no, actually in China, you had the same thing. And in 1922, this film may not be primarily screened in a cinema, like a 1,000-seat or 500-seat cinema. It may be screened in a tea house. It may be screened in some kind of pre-existing infrastructure where people would gather for entertainment. And it might be just one part of a broader variety program. So yeah, you might have.
Like it was in the West. I mean, that happened very frequently in the US and in other cultures where you'd have singers, dancers, musicians, and now come the films, and then they would show, some films.
Yeah, and it was definitely part of a continuum for a lot of these filmmakers. A lot of them had a background in the theater. So they were from the theater originally, and they're like, hey, we got to get into the cinema thing. It seems to be hot right now. But some of them would even make films that they called like chain-linked films. You had it in Japan too, where they would film a sequence and then they would live act a sequence and then they would go back to the film. But of course, this completely falls apart if somebody is sick that day. And so that didn't last very long. But in the 1920s, you had that going on all the time. And I think it's part of this vaudevillian ethos. It was not just US. You had the similar things going on in China too, and not just tea houses, but also like entertainment complexes that were being built from 1910s onward.
You brought a couple of clips for us to look at, Christopher. Can we see those now?
Yeah, I wanted to just show a couple of brief clips from contemporaneous films from Hollywood. So I'm not going to summarize the plot of these because I don't think it's too important, but Buster Keaton is a well-known silent comedian. And let's just watch this clip or this is actually several different clips, which I've edited together. So it's pretty short. And see, there's one motif that you'll see that appeared in this 1921 film that reappears in Laborer's Love. So let's take a look. So this is from the very end of the film. This is a dream sequence. So that's the first. There's just one other Buster Keaton film I want to show that's from the same year that Labor's Love came out. And again, I think you can get a sense that there's a pattern here. There's something shared between, US and Chinese cinema. It was not just a one-time thing. So in this film, Keaton is a fresh graduate from an engineering school. And this is what he's been working on, his commission to build an electric house. And I would mention that in a lot of the early Chinese film fanzines from the 1920s, they show Buster Keaton, they show Charlie Chaplin. Like these were films that were screened in China. And I want to show just one other example of what I would consider to be an intertext. This is from several years later, so right, 7 years later. And this is part of the Kung Fu craze, where you have a woman warrior. And this is a very lucrative genre. You had serial films, 16-part films, but where she's going to go fight off these people who have been bullying. But unfortunately, they have this gimmick that at least deters her for a short moment. So I think that there's something going on here in the motifs that you get in the set design. And you get other things going on too with you get other things going on too in terms of like character design. So I want to give just one final example here of a film that by Harold Lloyd called Never Weaken, in which at the beginning of the film, he is fishing for a bride from one window of an office building to the other. And both of them are slacking on their jobs. And if you notice what appears in the dialogue, in the intertitles here, you'll see a plot point that was borrowed by Labor's Love. This is something that had been pointed out by the film historian Xinyu Dong in an article she wrote several years back. So we have this young man who wears glasses. We have a boy meets girl story. And we have a young woman who works for a doctor's office. And so there's a lot of plot similarities. This is something that has been pointed out by another film historian named Xin Dong, who I think did really pioneering work at looking at some of these connections between Hollywood and early Chinese film. But there's a lot going on. There's a lot that may not meet the eye at first glance in this film. And so even though this is a short slapstick piece, and they may not have been able to get a lot for it, you get the sense that there's this improvisatory quality and that they're drawing inspiration from all kinds of different sources.
Great. Hey, let's go on if we could, because I have too much more time before we turn to questions, with a little bit more talk about perhaps the Great Road. Weihong, one of the things that when I started learning about Chinese film, people would speak very much about this period of the 1930s as being the period of leftist film. And some of that had to do with the fact that when really the first real history of Chinese cinema, the one by Chen Jihua that was prepared for the party, I think, and published in '63, was first published, it really focused on these films like The Great Highway or other films of that era that were often made by people who, if not communists, were sympathetic or considered fellow travelers or whatever. Talk about that element of left-wing politics within a film like The Great Road, or really the films of this period.
That's a great question, Richard, and it's a complicated. I think you might not to ask that question. So it really, in a way, opened a can of worms. There's no easy answer, and I think the typical understanding is that this writing, precisely this very important canonical 2-volume history of Chinese cinema, has basically set the tone of understanding 1930s cinema. The mainstream was considered as being left-wing, whereas in reality, this is only a small number of films that have survived. The majority of the films are actually commercial cinema. So I think that really changed our understanding. And it's also very important, I think, in our previous discussion with Chris and you, we realized that these are, it's hard to label them, even though it's very clear, as I already saw from the chat, that some of the audience could see the kind of CCP connection because of the political ideology. But to call it left-wing, I think is also not necessarily that it's communists, right? So it's important, as Chris was mentioning in our earlier discussion, this is actually very pro-nationalist. You can see the army uniform was actually a nationalist army uniform. This is not communist army. And the studio that produced the film had very strong historical connection with the nationalist army. And the film director, for example, Sun Yu, was educated in Tsinghua University and then came to the United States to receive his education in film, first in Wisconsin and later in New York City. So there's a very strong connection with the liberal West. And how do we define that left is very challenging, but I think they are sympathetic, as you can see from the ideology. It's very progressive. It critiques the kind of class hierarchy. There's a very strong emphasis and respect for labor, right? You really see the kind of collective community. There's a celebration of youth, all of that. So Sun Yu was not a party member, very clearly. But I think there's the kind of progressive political ideology that's associated with this film as well as a number of films, as you can see in the Street Angel that Chris is going to introduce very soon, and other films. So I think the left-wing film legacy cannot be neglected, but it should be understood with the understanding that there's a much broader context of filmmaking and film consumption that's really rooted in the commercial film cinema. And there are a lot of much broader kind of horizon of film production that is not included in this very narrow view of Chinese cinema in the 30s being left-wing and more specifically being associated with the Communist Party.
Right.
I mean, what is?
Could you talk a little bit about? Sorry, excuse me. I was just going to say, if I could ask you to talk a little bit about, for me, one of the most remarkable sequences, which is, of course, the one when Lily Lee sings the song of Old Fan Young. And there we see images there of tanks and people invading villages and, of course, of the flood and whatever. What would have been the context for that? And how might that have been received by a Shanghai audience?
I think that they would receive it in a few ways. And part of it is as documentary. So there was an actual catastrophic flood in the early 1930s that affected millions of people. And the suggestion, historians believe that some of the footage from that of flooded villages was actual footage from the recent events. There are also, staged shots of heroic Chinese troops resisting the invaders and fleeing villagers that were shot on a studio set. And there are many such montages there, but they're alluding, again, I believe, to recent conflicts and the invasion of China by Japan, particularly in the Northeast. And this was still front of mind in 1934 when this film was made. But another part is the genre element, that there you get many films in the 1930s and into the 40s featuring songstresses, and often displaced or wandering songstresses. So Li Li's character is indeed someone who used to be a ballad drum singer. This is referenced right before she sings in Jin Yan's character, right? That strapping man who sings at the beginning. He's like, hey, you've been on the Jianghu, you've been around all around China, you've seen something of the world, sing for us. And he's like putting her back in this role of like, sing us a pleasing song. And she does it with a smile on her face. She gets everybody to play instruments and join her. And then we have the lyrics for the song that she sings. So it's something you can sing along to, right? You can learn it. And she sings about midget devils with bayonets in hand. Who does that refer to? Everybody in China knows exactly who she's referring to there. Mm-hmm. So it's very pointed, even though, and you can see traces of censorship in this film too. Stanley Kwan made a film, a biopic, very kind of a postmodernist biopic of Ran Yu called Ran Yu, or Center Stage, many years later, in which somebody plays Li Li, somebody plays Ran Yu, and they have Li Li's character referring specifically to the Great Road and saying, oh, the enemy is coming, because we can't say Japan, because the nationalist government would not let you say Japan. So you have to just say the enemy. But so audiences then were pretty savvy, and they would be able to extract many types of meaning from just that sequence.
Weihong, how did censorship operate in the 1930s? Would there have been, would you have to approve of a script or a final cut? And also, how widely were these films seen around China?
Great questions, and indeed, all of the films were censored. I mean, the censorship started around 1927, and by 1931, it became very strict, and that's also why martial arts film went down with this strengthening of the censorship. Part of it is also consolidation of smaller film studios. So all of the film script did have to go through censorship as well as the film. And for example, A New Woman was cut quite a bit. Part of it was because the film heavily criticized the journalism culture, and there's a tremendous protest from the journalists. And so the censorship, in a way, does not just stand for the government, but a variety of political and commercial interests. The films are actually, so one very interesting question from the chat, I think we'll get to that. The films are widely shown, and it's also interesting to think about Chinese movie theater in terms of first run, second run, and third run. So first run theaters are mainly devoted to foreign films, especially the big 8 film studios from the United States, right? So all the major, for example, the Grand Theater in Shanghai, or Cathay Theater. They were mainly showing foreign films. So the Chinese films are mainly showing the second and third run theaters, interestingly. But that also means it's a much broader audience who are less educated. The elite class actually go to see foreign films. For example, one of the very important May 4th literary scholar Lu Xun, if you look at his diary, he left a diary in which he wrote a lot about films. It turned out he went to movies a lot with his wife and his son. And a lot of the films that he watched were mostly foreign films, a lot of Hollywood films, a lot of adventure films. Very rarely did he mention Chinese film. But for the broader audience, actually they watch a lot of Chinese film. And that's also why films such as Labor's Love, which is largely a slapstick comedy, is very popular because in a way, it kind of transcends the linguistic barrier, right? Even including the written language, because it's largely physical comedy. You don't even need to be literate to be able to understand it. So that is very interesting to think about. And another thing I want to mention is that beyond the movie theaters, right, starting from early 1930s, China started to promote educational film. And educational film is not just in terms of the content, but more in terms of film exhibition. So what was happening is that the Chinese the Minister of Education and the government was subsidizing for local culture centers and the military to send film projection teams to the factories, to the countryside, to various parts. And in those places, earlier films like this were actually shown. And so it's not necessarily chronological. Earlier films were also shown later. So that's also one thing to consider in terms of the reception of these films.
Okay, let's get to at least some of the questions we have in our chat. We've got quite a few. One of the first questions was really about the cinematic style. This viewer mentioned that from Labor's Love to The Great Highway or The Great Road, you see an incredible growth in just the sophistication and the use of film language and whatever. Perhaps could you talk, both of you, about that? And what were these filmmakers, and you mentioned Sun Yu already spent some time in the States, but what kind of films were around them in Shanghai at that time from which they might be drawing influence?
Chris, do you want to start?
And this is a huge question about like film form. And of course, I'm very curious about, what Chinese films were doing that were similar to other filmmakers around the world and what they were doing that was different. And you have to really parse out, you have to be very precise in talking about what was the same or different. And so sometimes, and I will say also that Chinese filmmakers were keenly interested in trying to formulate an indigenous aesthetic or a Chinese aesthetic. This was definitely a preoccupation for film theorists of this age. So, and I think there's a lot in common, right? I showed a couple of examples from Labor's Love where we get similar motifs. I would say that some things are different, and often it, part of it comes down to language. So even in silent films, you will get linguistic puns represented that only work in Chinese. Like there's not the same association in English. So splitting the melon in Chinese, right, is a kind of a sex joke. And that's the very first thing that Carpenter Zheng does when we see him on screen. And but there are, I think, other things you could look at as well. So I'm not sure how common it was in Hollywood films of that time period to have the lyrics appear on screen during a musical number. So you had some formal elements that became standardized in China to a greater degree than in some other cinemas. And trying to parse out like what was the push and pull or what were the forces shaping this can be quite difficult, especially when you consider that, like in the 1920s, a lot of film companies either made money or didn't based on whether or not they could sell a print to Southeast Asia. So yes, there was a Chinese market, but I think the infrastructure was was still relatively underdeveloped in some ways. And so there was a real financial consideration. And so that may also affect the form of the films themselves. What do you think, Weihong?
Yeah, I think those are really important factors. I actually would recommend Chris' book because he does such beautiful analysis of the films where I think audience can learn more about film style. I just want to quickly add, I think it's really important, and I think it's great to see those two films together, to see the difference in terms of cinematic style that are kind of epochal, right? In a way, the first one is from early 1920s that still has the residue of what we usually understood as early cinema. In the American context, early cinema are before 1913, right? This is before narrative integration, and people talk about it. A very great, important film scholar, Tom Gunning, described it as cinema of attraction. So, and you can see a lot of elements in the Laborers' Love in terms of almost like an exhibitionist mode, right? So it's not about hiding the audience as if you're a voyeur, but the audience is being acknowledged. There's a kind of direct interaction with the audience, and a lot of it is about directly provoking the laughter and almost breaking the narrative to some extent. Narrative is not as well integrated. So whereas when you look at films such as Big Road, definitely narrative is quite seamless, right? The spectator is no longer part of the film. You're being invisibly watching the film unfold seamlessly. And in terms of the international film horizon, it's very telling. If we look at Chinese newspapers and film journals from the 1920s and 30s, in the 20s, and I have to say from the 1910s onward, there are a lot of serialized action thrillers, right? So that is a big impact. Even in the earlier moment, it's really French paté film before Hollywood films that were very popular. And so you definitely see the impact in early films like Laborers' Love. And whereas in the 30s, it's quite international because there's the Soviet influence already. So you do see some of the audience were commenting on how sophisticated the film style was. It has a lot to do with the use of montage, right? And so in the Big Road, there's also the reverse shooting. You can see the kind of rewinding, people coming back to life from death, double exposure, the very interesting use of light and shadow. So German expressionist cinema was quite important. French cinema was important, right? And in terms of Sun Yu, the director who directed The Big Road, many people compare him with American film director Frank Bozak. And so you do see some of the very interesting kind of sentimental elements, and people describe Sun Yu as a film poet. So there are always those kind of interesting moments. For example, the knocking on the head, comedic. So all this kind of poetic tropes that recur. So I think it's really helpful to think about cinematic style in relation to the very broad international horizon of film exhibition in China, but also the market consideration that Chris, I think, very importantly remind us.
Richard, can I add one thing to that?
Sure, please.
So yesterday, the most recent film to be published on the YouTube channel and the Chinese Film Classics website is called Woman Warrior of the Wild River 6, Rumble at Deerhorn Gully. This is from 1930, and it's a partially extant film. It was one of those serialized martial arts films where they made many, many versions. It was adapted from a novel. But that, and this one, the English translation was actually done by a high school student on the East Coast, very precocious translator. But this is the type of fragment that we have to deal with and that we can access when we're trying to get a sense of these indigenous genres like wuxia, right? These martial chivalry genres. But even then, in these quintessentially Chinese genres that were, taking the publishing world by storm and very quickly went into cinema, you can still see these international influences in the costumes that people wear. Some of them look like they're out of Three Musketeers. They're like these swashbuckling costumes. So the notion of trying to get to an authentic aesthetic from here or there it's really, really messy, but it's a lot of fun. That's one of the things that makes cinema so much fun. Is like cinema has its own momentum. It seems it sometimes ignores the politics we like to impose on it.
Mhm. I sometimes think that for a lot of the filmmakers in the 30s, when I speak of an American influence to my students, for example, I mean, on some level, a formal influence, but it's really almost the idea of America. I mean, I think America was the modern, and these filmmakers were many things, but they really were modernizers. They really wanted to make China modern, whatever that problematic term might mean. And America was the example of that. So that's why, we don't see it so much in The Great Road, but I mean, when you get to, things like Crossroads or Street Angel or a lot of the other films, they're really in a certain way wanting to have a certain kind of American-ness, whatever they do formally.
Yeah, and it's not just China, this notion of Americanism, right? And that was what fascinated, for example, German filmmakers and the great Frankfurt School scholars such as Krakauer and Benjamin were equally fascinated by America, because America stand for something that is fresh, that is not like Europe, the old continental Europe, and something that's less constrained. And even in films such as Big Road, you see the element, right? Li kissing Chen Ye and the two female filmmakers, and she was dragging her to the top of the cliff to basically watch the male swimming in nude. And so those are like really brave scenes. So I think it's really important to recognize those moments.
There's nothing left-wing about that necessarily.
There's another question that expands on something that Chris mentioned before, and that was about export. At this time, was there much of an export market? And there was specifically a question about, were these films seen in the United States?
Yes, definitely so. And I'm actually quite excited about that aspect. And I've done some research, and there were several cities in United States that were showing Chinese film from quite early on. Actually, one important source is to look at the US film censorship record, and you can see what foreign films that were shown. And so in New York, Chinatown, definitely in San Francisco, Chinatown, and San Francisco luckily still has one Chinese film theater that has survived. And so it's also called the Great Star Theater. We're actually trying to revive that theater. So it's got a very interesting history from 1920s onward. And there's record of films being shown. There was also a local newspaper that discussed those films, and you can see advertisement. They were also shown in Canada. So Vancouver, for example, was very important. And Chris, that might be somewhere we can find information. Seattle, definitely in the United States, and also South America. And so for example, Love and Duty, that was one of the very important silent films starring Randy Yi, was recently discovered in Uruguay. And we also have another film that was discovered in Norway, and this is the Web of the Spider Woman. And so that one was The Cave of the Spider Woman, made in 1937. That was long considered lost, but it showed up in the Norwegian film archive with Norwegian subtitle.
The interesting thing about archives, you never know what comes up there.
Yeah, I always dreamed about finding those films somewhere else.
Yeah, the question I like to read, because it's an interesting one, and of course you two are the best to answer it. This says, beyond spoken language, the films include many intertitles written in traditional Chinese rather than the simplified Chinese that became the mainstay of post-1950s mainland China. Knowing that Kaoshu, which offered inspiration for the development of simplified Chinese, predates 1949, how did cinema impact the evolution of China's written script in both grammar and the characters themselves? Fascinated by the question. This is one that's way beyond me.
Really well-informed question.
Really? No, we have a wonderful audience.
Christy, you are the literary scholar. I have some thoughts, but I wonder.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just rereading the question. Actually, this is from the translator of Woman Warrior of the Wild River. Hey, Frank. So there we go.
No fair.
Yeah, no fair. But he didn't tell me he was going to ask this question. So I think that, yeah, cinema did change Chinese language in multiple ways. It is not just a reflection of Chinese language. I haven't made a particular study of this, but you do, like when you translate these films, you become acutely aware of how much Chinese language has changed since then. Or when the person who's writing the intertitles is writing in a very literary style versus a more colloquial or vernacular style. And there's other things that you can detect in especially early talkies where the dialogue can sound a little bit stilted as if people are brushing up their Mandarin. They've just had voice coaching in this. So I think there was a significant influence, and cinema also popularizes certain idioms. And you can see this very much in later films that have government backing and extremely wide distribution. So with a film like Labor's Love and The Great Road, I don't think the impact on language would be that great, but maybe a bit more so for later films. And again, it's not just talking, it's also singing. But certainly the standard for script back at that time was all traditional characters. There are only very few cases of like handwritten intertitles that are in a calligraphic style, say.
I just want to recommend a book by a former student of mine, Zhong Yuro. She wrote a wonderful book called The Chinese Grammatology, Script Revolution and Literary Modernity. And so she really traces different kind of linguistic reform, which has a lot to do with the script reform. And one thing I want to mention is James Yan or Yan Yang-chu, who's a very important reformer. And he was educated in Yale. And one thing that was very important for him was that he supported the people who China sent people to help the Allied forces to participate in the First World War. So there were farmers and workers sent to France. And during the First World War, they were trying to communicate with their family, but they didn't know how to write the Chinese language. The written script was a challenge. So Yan Yang-chu actually invented a very simplified form for people to be able to communicate. And so later on, Yan and other people were doing the kind of rural educational movement experiment in Hebei, Ding County in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And so they did use a number of media to help with the script reform. And so slideshows, Magic Lantern was important. They also used film. So this is one element when film was literally participating in the language reform movement and also the kind of mass literacy movement. So I think that's a fascinating question. Another thing I just want to quickly mention is, for example, in what we now understood as very complicated of a notion of left-wing cinema, one film is called The Spring Silkworm. And so it really tried to experiment with the script and use script as a very expressive medium, right? It's not just recording dialogue, but use written form as a visual form to express. And so there are moments when the characters become large and small, and they also become animated. So there's a tremendous investment in script itself as a kind of expressive medium.
You can see animated script too in films like A String of Pearls, where like these pearls arrange themselves into the characters for huo huan, or misfortune, right, or calamity. And so there is, yeah, Weihong is absolutely right. I think that, for the cover of my book, I chose an Art Deco representation of the character Ying for cinema or shadow. And there is so much innovation going on this period, the early 20th century, in terms of script and making script into art. That itself deserves a study.
I also want to mention that when another student of mine is now writing a dissertation on intertitle, and she's definitely looking at the changing of written form in relation to design. And she actually tracked down some of the people who wrote the intertitle. Many of them were calligraphers. So you can identify who actually wrote the intertitle. They were really beautiful. And it's not just in the films, you can see from the press book. The press book were very colorful and elaborate. And usually they would invite calligraphers to write for them. So writing is a very important dimension of cinema.
It's fascinating, actually. There's if it hasn't been written yet, a great book to talk about the influence cinema had on both spoken and written language. There have been studies, for example, of how modern Italian really came through the cinema, that it was really the kind of Italian that they decided on, that all Italians should more or less understand, kind of codified the language. And I've heard a similar claim for Hindi as well. But anyway, that's for another time. And now I'd like to turn it back. First of all, thank Christopher and Weihong so much, and back to Dinda.
But you know what? Not yet. I came on not to call an end to this party, just because I think that this is such a fascinating conversation that if you want to go, ask a couple more questions, I think let's do it. It's just so interesting. And then why don't we give it another 5 minutes or so? If you want to jump in, I'll read one question I see here, which was, and then I'll hand it back to you, Richard, for a couple more. But okay, one person in the audience says there was a surprising amount of female eroticism in The Great Road. What's our take on that?
You're mistaken. There was none. No, actually, I've gotten very different reactions from, say, students or colleagues to a film like The Great Road, because some of it is unexpected. And is this, homoerotic or just homosocial, right? Some people insist that this is just homosocial, right? Is this for the men in the audience, for the women in the audience? Like, what kind of gender politics do you want to read out of that? So I'm open to different theories, but I do think it's an extraordinary example, like following on that sequence where we have these two women talking about the men that they love while cuddling each other. And then they go and watch these men bathe naked in the river. And then they have a melon orgy up on the hillside. And I mentioned that melon sex symbolism thing. And it's like these manly men, like literally ripping apart a gigantic melon. So I feel like there's stuff going on in this sequence that is not left wing, not right wing. It's maybe it's Sun-Yu's personal interests, but we see this in many different films. There's a great book by Sang Zilan called The Emerging Lesbian, if you're interested in not just cinema, in which you do have later films with cross-dressing, women dressing up as men and then falling in love with each other. I wish that film survived, but it doesn't. This is part of the culture. This is not a one-off thing either, that there was a lot of interest in gender politics and the possibilities and how they're changing. And so there's so many films called like Three Modern Women, or New Women, or women, women, women. Like, we are obsessed with women in 1930s Chinese cinema, that they are central to most of the stories.
Some of that might be because I think women were seen as kind of markers of modernity, that in a way, the progress that women had made was symbolic of the progress for all of society. Goddess is pretty much built on that principle. Weihong?
Yeah, very much so. And Goddess is such a, in a word, controversial film, even from today's point of view, right? On the one hand, it's really about the prostitute, but the prostitute is also saint because she is such a good mother. So it's a very kind of complex film. It's both Confucian and modern. So that kind of very complicated, depiction. And women really embody this complexity.
One of the things I love about China Institute programs is that we bring in amazing audiences. So not only do we have Frank Zhou, who, as you were saying, was the translator of Woman Warrior, but we've got Jeffrey Tao, who's a leading translator at the United Nations. And he's asking, in Labor is Love, characters seem to be portrayed as being without any moral compass. Kids help themselves to fruit at the vendor. The carpenter removes steps in a ladder to cause injuries to benefit the doctor whose daughter he wishes to marry. Can you please comment on the lack of moral compass?
Yeah, and slapstick slapstick can sometimes be a little bit tricky, right? If people are falling down. In this case, there's some comic justice going on because our laborer lives right below the all-night club, right? And so they've been partying and they're rowdies. And so they would be kind of liumang types. And I think audiences would be prejudiced against them, and they're bullies and they pick on women and stuff. So no problem if they get hurt. The kids one is funny. I mean, children and animals is the truism. And I get the sense that these were like neighborhood kids brought on set. There's that cute boy who bursts into tears when he gets the fruit taken away from him at the end. So it is a little bit of an amoral universe, but I think so much of the overtone for me is tongue-in-cheek, and that the father is not meant to be taken seriously. He's such a quack buffoon, and he's not a patriarchal authority figure, and there's all this winking at the camera, that it's all meant to be good, clean fun.
That's true, and I think that's also very true for American slapstick comedy, right? In a way, is to push the envelope of moral order. At the same time, we can also say this is the capitalist moral order. It becomes a very interesting comment on the exchange value.
Well, there is something carnivalesque about it, the idea of turning the world upside down, that suddenly all the old relationships no longer make any sense. And maybe that also is something the film is saying, that in this modern world, getting ahead is really the sort of message, and that how you do it doesn't particularly matter.
Yeah, I guess we should draw this to a close soon, but I did want to ask one last question, which I saw in the questions as well, which I thought was really interesting. It was someone who was asking, are there any parallels with today, or anything that we can look that's relevant to themes that we see in China today? And I'm curious as to what you all see in these films. I know you talked about nationalism, you talked various things. Can you make any comments on that?
Still getting a handle on China today. It seems to change week by week, and some very distressing national politics and cross-border politics. I will say that cinema seems about as important as ever, and both within popular culture as well as the kind of top-down political commemoration of various anniversaries. So I think that it's still a very vibrant space. And I just taught 2 film courses at UBC online, and in the history of Chinese cinema course, we concluded partly by pointing out that the cinema industry is so small compared to the video game industry. Like where is the cultural center of gravity? But even when you acknowledge that, these narratives and these stories and images do have a lot of power. At the same time that, one of the ways that my job has changed tremendously is in the last year, I've had to become a filmmaker myself. And I think this is happening across the world, at least in education, where you have to worry about camera angles and microphones. And so you become aware of film form in a new way when you have to be producing the films yourself. And so I think this is probably going on in China as well. We all have cell phone cameras and the like. And there are many people with amazing expertise. So I don't know if I can speak, precisely on the spot about these 2 films related to them. Comedy certainly is still very commercially successful. There are lots of great comic talents out there, and there are sure a bunch of nationalistic narratives where the censor has a heavy hand. And as someone who's, the Chinese language in my book came out in Taiwan, the mainland version is being held up at the censor as we speak. So this is very near and dear to me.
So Weihong, you mentioned something earlier about a keen interest that these films showed, or one of them showed a keen interest in developing a Chinese aesthetic, which it seems to me speaks to today as well. There is a keen interest today as well in sort of defining what is Chinese, what is the Chinese aesthetic.
Yeah, it's also kind of a very challenging question, because it also has to do with who gets to define China, what's considered Chinese, and what is considered Chinese cannot be possible without thinking about other countries. So a lot of times it's retrospective, right? So only when people encounter other countries, when they start to consider how to define Chinese aesthetics. A lot of times what is considered Chinese aesthetic is very modern and very modernistic. So now I think coming from different interests, that gets to be defined very differently. I do want to mention that when I showed these films in my undergraduate class, they were just astonished at how innovative those films are, how experimental. I think that's the spirit that I hope will carry forward to contemporary cinema. In a way, film was a very new medium at the time. And now I think there's another wave of technological innovation as well as aesthetics experiments. And people are much more exposed to the broader world. So it will be very interesting to see what new forms come out.
Richard, what do you think about why these films are still fun to watch today?
Well, I just think they're very good films. But one of the things that struck me, we didn't really get to talk about it, is this really was a period when, as Professor Li Wufang talks about in his book, we almost should talk about more of a Shanghai cinema than a Chinese cinema, because these films were so centered around that phenomenon that was and is Shanghai. And actually, one of the things that I love about, you could say, contemporary Chinese film, I mean, my two favorite Chinese films in recent years were Kylie Blues and An Elephant Sitting Still. And, these are done in really parts of China I at least have never really seen on film. And I think that's something that's really great. It goes into what Weihong was saying, what's Chinese? Is it somewhere among the Miao people? Is it in these kind of really forlorn industrial cities? That to me is really a challenge about who gets to decide what is Chinese.
Wow, I just want to thank you all for this incredible walk through cultural history. What a tour de force that was. I loved what you said about these filmmakers as modernizers. I think that's a really, moving point, and the idea of, and also Christopher, what you said is that film cinema sometimes just ignores politics. I love it. Sometimes it's just funny. So I want to, time is up, unfortunately, but I just want to thank you all so much. You are all so brilliant and bring such different perspectives to the conversation. For the audience, these four people over the next, these three people over the next 3 weeks are going to each of them be talking about an individual film that also dates from the 30s, 40s. And I hope so much that you will tune in, because you can see that it is not just talking about film, it's talking about life, history, culture, and these are just incredibly brilliant speakers. So please tune in again next week and the week after and the week after. And in the fall, we can't wait to start the new series with Richard Peña about sort of the greatest films in since the 1980s. So thank you all so much for tuning in. It's just an absolute delight to hear all of you. So thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Thanks
everyone.
for
Richard, Weihong, Linda.
Brilliant.
Thanks.